Okay. Well, thank you for being here this morning. It's my understanding that today's the last day that the ski resorts are open, so you all get extra points for being here today. When I was writing my thesis, I was reintroduced to a noted 20th century Jewish thinker by the name of Martin Buber. Mr. Buber was probably the first philosopher, at least the first that I know of, who developed a philosophy of relationships. That is, he sat down and tried to think seriously about what relationships are, how they function, how they are influenced, and how they influence, etc. His most famous book, one that is studied in seminaries and universities everywhere to this day, is known as I, Thou. And I'll get to the meaning of that title here in just a moment. But I think the ideas that Buber has in his writings are useful to us, or can be used fruitfully for us as we try to read the religious stories in the Bible and in other places. They can give us some concepts that we can use to try to understand, or at least to think about what may be going on in these stories and what these stories are pointing to beyond themselves. So let's review the story just very quickly. Just hit the high points. Today's gospel is found in John's gospel. Those of you that have been around here for a while, you've heard me date the gospels from time to time. And you may remember, you probably don't, but you may remember that John's gospel was the last gospel to be written, and that it was written approximately, no one knows exactly, but approximately in the year 95 CE, or we used to call it AD, now it's changed to CE, or the Common Era, 95 CE. And the New Testament scholars think that Jesus was crucified sometime between 30 and 33 CE. So we're talking about a theological narrative that was written approximately 60 to 65 years after the events that it talks about. I only mention that because a very, very similar story shows up in Luke's gospel. The Gospel of Luke, as you remember, was the gospel that was written in about 85 CE, or about 10 years before the Gospel of John. Luke tells a similar story, a very, very similar story to the one John is telling, only he places the event at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The same sort of event happens as Jesus is recruiting his disciples, and it is because of this event in Luke's gospel that Peter and others join the followers of Jesus. So the story goes something like this. These guys were fishermen. They decided to go back and do what they knew best, which was to go fishing. They spent all night at it. Don't know what that would be like, but it had to be awfully frustrating. They spent all night working the nets out on the Sea of Tiberias, and nothing happened. They didn't catch a thing. So they're coming back to shore at sunup, no doubt exhausted and frustrated. And they see some fellow on the beach who is yelling at them, or shouting at them loud enough that even though they're 100 yards out, they can hear him. And he's saying, "You haven't caught anything, have you?" And they said, "Well, no, we haven't." "Well, try again." Well, that's exactly what they wanted to hear, right? That's exactly what you and I would have been eager to do, was to try again. But for some reason, they actually try it again. And of course, this time they hauled in a big batch of fish, and they came on shore, and the stranger was cooking them breakfast, and they threw some of their catch in on the breakfast, and one thing led to another, and eventually all of them recognized that this stranger that had been giving them advice on how to fish was Jesus, the risen Jesus. And then at the end of the gospel story, you have this, I think, very powerful, poignant sort of exchange between Jesus and Peter. A conversation about love, a conversation about commitment, a conversation about one's mission in life. Well, so let's get into Buber's ideas, and then we'll see how they may apply or help us to think about today's gospel lesson. Martin Buber suggested something that no one had suggested before in exactly the same way. He said, this is not a quote, this is my interpretation of what he said, but he said that relationships for human beings are to us the same as water is to fish. In other words, we live our lives in this sea of, this matrix, this network of human relationships. And in that matrix, or in that sea of relationships, we live and move and have our being. That we are literally formed, shaped, influenced, made who we are because of our relationships with other human beings. And they are shaped and formed by their relationships with us. We are, therefore, in essence, relational beings. Now, at the heart of this idea, Buber turns to linguistics, to the philosophy of language. And he makes language central to this idea that relationships operate based upon human communication. We're always communicating in one way or another with each other. Even when we're not saying something, we're communicating. This is extra for no extra charge, but just sort of think about this. Just think about this going forward. All behavior is communication, right? So you don't have to be saying something to communicate. Communication can be a look. It can be a body posture. It could be lots of different things. Okay, I won't. That's a different subject some other time. All right, so Buber suggested that you and I live our lives communicating with other people with whom we are in relation. And that we have what he called two attitudes or two stances that we move in and out of constantly. You could think of it as sort of two categories of communication, two ways of talking to other people. But it's more than that, it's also two ways of thinking about the other person. And the first category he called I-it. And the second category he called I-thou, as in the King James English, thou as in you. So it's I-you relationships. I-it and I-you relationships. And we go back and forth between those two stances or attitudes all the time. We live in this sort of running stream of human communication composed primarily of these two categories. So let's talk first about what it means to be in relation with another human being with the attitude of I-it. So a synonym for I-it is utilitarian. I-it relationships are utilitarian relationships. They have a sort of practical dimension to them. They're a kind of business contract. Or another way of thinking about it is they are role specific. In utilitarian relationships, we're acting out societal roles with each other. And that keeps us contained in a very narrow relational spectrum. Okay? So utilitarian relationships are fairly narrow and focused by definition. Let me give you an example. Think of the last time you went to a restaurant to eat. Okay? You probably had a waitress or a waiter wait on your table. And during the course of that evening, I doubt that waitress ever asked you about whether or not you loved art and what kind of art you loved. I don't think she asked you about that traumatic event that took place in the first grade that altered the course of your life. She didn't bother to ask you about your deepest hurts and hopes, did she? In fact, if she did, it would have kind of freaked you out. That's how you know you're in an I-it relationship, is if people start to get personal, we get to squirming very quickly. No, she was interested in three things. She wanted to know, did you want to sit? What did you want to eat and drink? And how are you going to pay for it? That was the scope of her interest in your life. Your interest in her wasn't a whole lot broader, right? You want to know, can this woman take an order? And will she bring me my food sometime in the next 4 or 5 hours while I'm still interested? Right? That was the extent of your interest in her. Why? Because you were in a utilitarian relationship. You were there to get something from her. She was there to get something from you. Now, there is nothing wrong with utilitarian relationships. They're where we spend most of our time. If you think about how society operates, how organizations operate, we're generally operating out of our roles all the time. I'm in an I-it relationship with you right now. Right? You have certain expectations about what I'm supposed to be doing right now. You're not interested too much in anything else about me. You want to know, you just want me to deliver a good sermon. Right? It's an I-it relationship. Nothing wrong with that. That's how the world works. That's how society is able to function. If we didn't have I-it relationships, we wouldn't be able to go to work in the morning, know what we're supposed to do when we get to work. We wouldn't be able to go to the grocery store or any store and get things that we need. Society operates based upon these utilitarian role plays. Nothing wrong with that, unless that becomes all you're capable of. Then there's a problem. Now, Buber says that the I-thou, I-you, or intimate personal relationship is a different animal. In contrast to the utilitarian relationship, the intimate personal relationship is not primarily motivated, and I'm not saying that there's not some part of you that wants something from the other person, but the primary motivation in an intimate relationship, an I-thou relationship, is that you simply have become deeply desirous and curious to know the soul of this other person. And they have developed the same attitude about you. So you have a coming together of at least two people whose primary motivation is nothing more than to be present with you and to know all there is they can about you. In an I-thou relationship, in this kind of relationship, questions like who and what you love, questions about what happened in your life as you were growing up, questions about what your deepest hurts and hopes are, questions about those secrets that you carry around in the back of your mind and in your heart, questions about your pain as well as your joys. Those are not only appropriate, they're necessary in order to get to intimacy, in order to get to I-thou. Now, let me tell you a story that sort of captures or takes a photograph of an I-thou relationship. This is a story told by a woman by the name of Maria. Maria says the following. She says, when I was going to high school, I was a senior in high school, there was a girl who lived down the street from me by the name of Lisa. Now, Lisa and I didn't hang out together. We went to the same school, and we rode the same school bus. And yeah, we lived on the same street, several houses apart, but we had a different circle of friends, and we really never knew each other much beyond our first names. But all that changed one day. One day, Lisa was getting off the bus at the end of the day after school, and right as she stepped off the bus, a car came over the hill. She didn't see the car didn't see her. She got hit. And the next thing I know, an ambulance is taking Lisa off to the hospital. Now, I can't tell you why, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. I just became very worried about her. And I let this worry go on for 2 or 3, 4 days, and finally I just couldn't stand it anymore. So I got the phone number for her room in the hospital, and I called her just to check on her. And what happened was completely unexpected. We began to talk. And we talked. And we talked. And we talked. We talked in a way that was wonderful and unexpected. As we talked, Lisa began to share some very intimate personal things about herself. She talked about what that accident was like for her, what frightened her about it then and what frightens her about it now. She talked about how it's altered her life in a certain way, changed her thinking about things. She talked about some of her dreams for the future, and when she started doing that, I started to share some of my dreams and some of my fears too, some of the things that I'm scared of, and how fear often influences my life. And we just talked like that for I don't know how long. I lost all track of time. All I cared about was just hearing as much about her as I possibly could absorb. And she told me by the end of the conversation, and I don't know how long we went, I think we went well over an hour. She's told me before I hung up that I had given her this incredible gift, this gift that no one else had given her, that I had listened to her. I had listened to her in a way that neither her doctors, nor her parents, nor her siblings, nor any of her closest friends from school, no one had listened to her and shared themselves with her the way that I had. And she thanked me profusely for bringing some note of healing into her existence. For me, I was just ecstatic that the conversation took place. I couldn't believe that this wonderful thing had happened, this conversation in which I lost all track of time. And all I remember as it was ending is that I didn't want it to end. I wanted it to keep going. I guess that's what happens when two people let down their guard and really open up to each other. So that's Marie's story. And I think that provides a little Polaroid snapshot of what an I-thou relationship begins to look like. So in closing, just to wrap up, Buber suggests that we spend our time communicating in relation with one another in two primary ways, I-it or utilitarian ways. That's the way that Jesus is communicating when he's coaching them on fishing. And I-thou or I-you or intimate personal relationships, which I think is exactly what's happening at the end of the story between Peter and Jesus, as they talk about love and commitment and mission in life. Now, Buber says that in order for us to be made whole, in order for us to be fully human, we must nurture and engage in not only I-it relationships, but I-thou personal, intimate relationships. Buber says you can't get all the way home. You can never be fully human, fully restored, fully healed inside, only by living in utilitarian relationships, only by looking at other people with respect to what have you done for me lately, or what can I get from you. In order for us to be fully human, in order for us to be healed and restored, we must develop, nurture, maintain intimate relationships. Relationships, in Buber's words, of mutual reciprocity, in which both parties share deeply of their hurts and hopes in life with each other. Now, theologically, I leave you with this thought, that really wonderful, special thing that happens when two people let down their guard and open themselves up and share in vulnerable mutual reciprocity, that wonderful something is the sacred. And you can think of this space between me and this other human being, this person with whom I am engaged in intimate I-thou relating. You can think of that in-between space as sacred space, as sort of the temple where the sacred shows up. Or maybe it's more comfortable to think of it as the high altar or the table of the Lord, where the presence of God is most keenly experienced. In that place between two people, in that moment of intimacy, is where the sacred shows up. And it's a sacred that restores us and heals us and makes us whole. So my prayer for me and for you is that in the coming weeks and months and years of our lives, we will get better and better at not only living into utilitarian relationships, but especially in developing and nurturing intimate relationships, so that we might find the healing that we all seek. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.